Okay, so a little bit of background about who I am. I am the vice president and the co-founder of a company called Business Forecast Systems. We're a small software company. We're located outside of Boston, and we develop and market the Forecast Pro product line. I've basically worked my entire career in the area of business forecasting. I started in 1986 at an engineering company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, developing forecasting software for the electric power industry. And actually that was in 1984. And in 1986 I started this company, Business Forecast Systems, and we came out with the first version of Forecast Pro in 1987. Over the years I have worked with lots and lots of companies, both large and small, and this has really enabled me to understand how businesses go about the forecasting process, and have some firsthand experience with some of the challenges that are involved therein. So today's topic is going to be identifying problems in your data and your forecasts, and this is a roadmap of how we're going to spend our time. So we're going to start off with sort of some generalities, explaining some of these approaches. And we're going to concentrate on two primary approaches to finding problems. One is called Outlier Detection, and this really concentrates in finding issues that may be present in the historic demand data. And the second one is exception reports. And this is really after forecasts are generated. It is a technique which allows you to sort of organize your time and organize the review process of the forecasts themselves. We'll also be touching upon the concept of Pareto or ABC categorization, and we'll see how that can also help us as we review outliers that have been detected or exceptions that have been found. As Eric said, I'll leave some time towards the end of the presentation for questions and answers. I'd like to just reiterate, you don't need to save your questions for the end. Feel free to send them in. We have several people here in the room with me who will be answering questions throughout the webinar, as well as collecting a few to answer live at the final Q&A session. In addition, if you ask a question and we don't get to it, we'll reply by email. So never fear, we will answer your questions. But let's get started. Okay. Forecasting has a lot of trade-offs, and one of the biggest trade-offs that we deal with as forecasters is this question about how much time and how much resources do we put into the forecasting process, and given the amount of time and resources that we're putting into the process, how accurate are our forecasts. So it is almost always the case that if I devote more resources, more time, I can improve accuracy. The question is, what's the right balance? And an excellent way to approach this is to try to quantify how much, in dollars, or whatever your local currency happens to be, how much money do we save or do we make by improving the accuracy of the forecast? There are companies that have set out to quantify this and have done so, and sometimes if the answer is quite a bit, for instance, let's say that I knew if I can improve the accuracy of my forecast by 5%, that might mean $20 million a year in savings. Well, if that's the kind of payback I can get, then it might make sense to spend a lot more resources than we are currently to try to reach that 5% improvement. So, for instance, again, if $20 million in potential savings are available, it might make sense to spend $2 million a year to improve the forecasting resources, maybe to hire additional forecasters or consultants, maybe to put in better solutions in place. On the other hand, if we determine that improving by 5% really doesn't get us that much, that the products that we're ordering, say, we have to order in container loads because they're shipped over from overseas, and perhaps a 5% improvement really doesn't change our ordering patterns or the payoff. So there we're not going to invest as much. But there is this question, and one of the primary trade-offs, one way to improve your forecast is to spend more time generating them with the aim to be more accurate, and more time reviewing them to find problems and address problems. And so the question is, what's the right amount of time? Ideally, in a perfect world, we would want to be able to review every single forecasting cycle, to review each product or each item individually and to scrutinize them and do the absolute best job that we can. If we're dealing with a relatively small forecasting job, say that we only have a couple hundred items that we're responsible for forecasting, then perhaps that's feasible. I'll go through each and every item. I will spend as much time as necessary with each one with the goal of improving my forecast to be as optimal as possible. On the other hand, we deal with lots of organizations that are forecasting thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different stock keeping units, often broken down by multiple locations, where the concept of individually reviewing every forecast generated is simply not feasible. We can't, if I'm responsible for doing 10,000 SKUs per week, I'm not going to be individually reviewing each one each and every week. It's just not possible. So what do? Well, what we try to do is to use the time that we do have available to our advantage. And that's really what today's talk is all about, which is when the amount of time and resources is limited, as it almost always is, how do we organize it? How do we prioritize it? How do we get the most, to use an American phrase, the most bang for the buck? You know, what activities do we want to engage in an effort to improve our forecast with the knowledge that our time and resources are limited? Okay, so what we're going to look at during this session is really what the last bullet is alluding to, which is there are some useful tools that help us to identify problems. These problems can exist in the historic data, and if there are problems in the historic data and we're using extrapolation methods to forecast, that means problems in the forecast. Or maybe we've already generated the forecast, and again, there are problems with them. So these tools are designed to help us identify problems, and once we've identified the problems, then we have to decide, again, how much human time do we devote to reviewing them? So the first thing we're going to look at is called outlier detection. We'll be talking about this in some detail, and I'll give you examples and a definition of what outliers are. But again, the outlier detection is used to identify potential problems in the history. So it's often done prior to generating statistical forecasts. What we're going to do is we're going to look through the history and look for problems. After we have done that, we generate forecasts. And after we generate the forecasts, the question is, are we satisfied with them? And that brings us to our second tool, exception reports. And exception reports are used to identify potential problems with the forecasts. So we're going to look at the forecasts we generated, we're going to scrutinize them, and try to look for places where they can be improved. We'll see that when using both of these approaches, that it's often very useful to concentrate on the subset of data that's most important to the company. And a couple things we can do that help us focus that way are to use, for instance, ABC codes, or what's called Pareto analysis, so that we concentrate on the items that are most important to the company first. We can also couple this with sorting and filtering to, again, allow us to look at these outlier reports, to look at these exception reports, and to know how to prioritize our review process. So we'll see all of this in action very shortly. We're going to start with outlier detection. And before we launch into it, we're going to start a simple poll and to see how many of us out there are actually using outlier detection. So Eric Sabatis will go ahead and open the poll. Okay, so the poll is up there. You should click on the answer that's appropriate. How often do you review your history to detect outliers? Never, occasionally, or every forecasting cycle. The results have come in. We'll close the poll. And let's display those results. And it looks like the most common answer here is occasionally, with about a little over 50%, about 54%. There's also a strong fraction of you, close to 30%, that are looking and detecting outliers each and every forecasting cycle. And another 20% or 17% that have never done so. So we've got a good mix today, and let's proceed. What are outliers? Well, an outlier is a historic data point that falls outside of the expected range. So put in very simple terms, it's an unusually large or perhaps an unusually small data point. Outlier detection is a method for finding outliers. What we do is we compare the historic data to some expected value for the history. And usually this is the fitted values from a forecasting model. We look at the size of the error, the difference between the fitted and the actual, and we flag points where that difference is larger than a threshold that we define as acceptable. Ideally, we do this, and then the forecaster would review all detected outliers and decide which ones warrant correction. When appropriate, correcting for an outlier can improve the accuracy of the forecasts. When inappropriate, it can actually hurt the forecast. So it's important to, part of this process is determining what outliers need attention and how do we go about correcting them. So here's an example. The green line on this slide depicts a historic demand series, and probably the most notable feature on that is this large peak here. This is an outlier. So you can see the red line. This is the fit to the data when we build a forecasting model, followed by the forecasts themselves. And in this data set, we've got a very large spike, and it's actually followed by another spike. So something happened here, and the month after it, something else, we also had a response. So this might have been, for instance, a promotion. So maybe this was a big promotion. It drove a lot of volume, and it caused some people to buy forward. So the next month was a low month. If we just ignore this and we create a forecast, there's an issue. It introduces these spikes in both the next year and in the forecast period where this promotion occurred, for instance, and that's an issue. So we want to correct for this, and there are a number of ways to do it. But let's start by, again, there's our historic outliers, and another circle indicating a poor forecast. So this is what we're trying to address. We want to address the historic outliers in an effort to improve the forecast. That's our goal. Now, how do we detect it? So we've got all these items, and this is one of them. How do we go about detecting it? There are different approaches. Most implementations in software for detection rely on a single pass through the data, where we fit the data and we look for big differences. An alternative approach and a best practice is to use an iterative process, where we look for the largest outlier, we correct for it, and then we use that corrected history to continue to look for outliers. So two sort of fundamentally different approaches, and we're going to show a few slides before we go into a live example to illustrate how they're different. So first, the single pass approach. So again, we looked at this before. The arrows are indicating that if we do the first pass and we look at the difference between the green and the red line and look for unusual points or outliers, we would probably detect three. This one, and this one here. Notice that that third one is a real problem because it didn't really exist in the history, whereas it's very easy to look at that green line and say, that's clearly an unusual value. That's clearly an unusual value. When I look at this green point on the graph, it's not clear that that's unusual. And furthermore, I think what we're really dealing with is that the fitted value is an issue and was being impacted by this very large outlier. So it actually, the outlier caused what I would call a ripple effect. The fact that we had one historically caused one in the same period the next year, and worse still, has a big leverage on the forecast. Okay, so here's the issue, and let's see how this outlier detection can correct for it. So first, the single pass approach. I'm going to take these outliers and replace them with their fitted values. So I'll take that green line, I'll replace it with this value. I'll take that green trough, replace it, and I'll take this green one here and replace it. So let's do that. And here's what you get. So what you're looking at now is the green line is the corrected history. And notice that this area is greatly improved. We had that great big spike and the great big trough. Those are gone, and we have much more typical values. So that's terrific. On the other hand, here was that third one. Here the correction actually did some damage because now we have a much higher value than we had originally, and it impacts our forecast as well. So this single pass approach, where I just look for large outliers and replace them in one fell swoop, it did improve this area, but unfortunately it hindered us here. It actually made things worse, and we still have a problem with the forecast. Now let's contrast that with an iterative approach. Okay, so we start off with the same data set. We start off with the same exercise of fitting the data. Now what we say, though, is, okay, here's the biggest one. Let's correct this one. Okay, so we're going to correct it. We're going to replace that green value with the red value. So we do that. So we've replaced this value. And you can see that looks much better. And we refit the model. Now we're looking at this graph, looking for outliers. And there are some. Here's one at the trough. Okay? Here's another one, which now is a trough. And again, this would be probably introduced. Another one of these ripple effects, which are very, very common, is actually introducing a problem here. But unlike the single pass approach, with the iterative approach, we're now just going to correct not both of these outliers on this second pass, but just the biggest one. Okay, so we're going to replace that. Now what is the biggest one, which is the trough. When we do so, here we are. We get this new green line. That's our new historic corrected demand. And we get the new fit. And it looks good. You see, we've corrected these 2 points. But that issue, that trough month here, is no longer here, because that wasn't a real outlier. It was a byproduct of the preceding outliers. So notice our forecasts, and they're much more representative of the data we have, and that's good. So, and at this point, when we look for outliers, we don't find any. So these would be the final forecast based on the corrected history. Let's contrast that. So this result, which found 2 outliers but used 2 iterations to do it, with the single pass approach we looked at earlier, which is here. So notice the difference in the forecast. Again, the 2-pass approach has a nice look to it. It's very similar to the corrected history for all 3 years. Okay? Whereas the single approach really has a very different forecast profile, and one of the most noticeable things is the spike, which really was not present and was introduced by the fact that we did a 1-pass approach. So again, the moral of the story here is that the multiple iterative process for finding and correcting outliers is superior to a single-pass approach. Okay, so let's actually now jump into an example with some real data. Okay. So this particular data set, it comes from the automotive industry. It has sale of aftermarket parts like mufflers and rims and various automobile aftermarket parts. It's broken down by territories. So we're looking currently at North Chicago. And then under that we have all the SKUs. And in this very simple example, I think we have 3,000 or 4,000 SKUs that we're working with. And the person who's responsible for forecasting this is forecasting it on a monthly basis. So let's see how we go about that. First of all, we're looking at an outlier report. Okay, so up above here are the outliers that the program has detected. And one thing is we've got a lot of them. Okay, so we've got hundreds and hundreds of outliers that have been detected, and we want to correct for them. And let me just actually do that. But before I correct, what I want to do is to sort and filter the data. So one thing you'll notice is I have some Pareto codes here, some ABC codes. Most of us are probably familiar with this idea. A type A item is a high volume item of importance to the company. A type B is a medium volume of medium importance, and a type C being of less importance to the company. So one thing I want to do is to concentrate on my type A items. So I'm going to go ahead and filter my report, just like in Excel. And instead of showing all of my Pareto codes, I just want to concentrate on type A. Okay, so I'm going to just filter our list so we're just showing type A items. Now, I still have quite a few type A items to look through, and let's consider what we're looking at. So we have the outlier, okay, which was a value of 900 in this example. We have a corrected value of 222, so the difference, which is labeled delta here, is 678. And so here are all the ones that we've been detected. And again, in an interest to prioritize my review, because that's what this is all about, if I'm going to spend time reviewing, how do I organize it? I'm going to sort this by the difference, or the delta, from largest to smallest. And then I'll start with the biggest error. So I'm going to double click on this. And here's the first one where an outlier was detected, or not actually the first one, but the biggest outlier was detected. And you can see on the graph we have 2 different points. It's kind of the reverse of what we just looked at in the slides. So we've got a big trough. That looks like it might have been, for instance, a stock out. And then the following month we've got a big peak. That probably means again, it was back in stock and we filled the back orders. And then we have normal demand. Notice the leverage these outliers have on the forecast. It's very, very strong. So this is definitely one that we need to take action on. So the question is, what kind of action do we take? And the answer is we have some choices. Okay, so this slide talks about, we find outliers, how do you want to address them? And we're listing some of the options. One option is to change the forecasting model. So remember, we're looking at the difference between how the model fits the data and the actual values. If we change the forecasting model that's used, that will change the fit and could correct the outlier. So one option is to use an alternative forecasting approach to model what actually happened. So in our example, if this really was a stock out, then we could build, for instance, an event model. We're going to do that in a minute, to actually model the stock out and the subsequent replenishment. So using an alternative forecasting method is appropriate when you know what caused the outlier. And ideally what you do is you use a forecasting method which accommodates what happened. Another option, number 2 here, is to correct the history manually. In other words, I've got an unusual data point. What if I just go into the database and change it so that now I'm creating a new history to base the forecast on? I would say proceed with caution. Generally speaking, you don't want to go changing the historic demand data. It complicates things quite a bit. We've got a history that's real. We have a corrected history that's being maintained in the database that's for forecasting, and it's messy. I would say correcting the history, ideally you use it when there's a problem with the history. So sometimes you get your files from IT. They've created some data extraction program, and you look at it and you realize something's wrong with the history. Maybe when they pulled the data, it came in wrong. So you switched the ERP systems and you mapped most of the products correctly, but a couple of them you got wrong. So when you go and detect outliers, these pop out, and we discover things that it's not an outlier because it was an unusual data point. It was an outlier because the data is wrong. And in those cases, definitely, let's go back and fix the history and work with the proper history. Another option here, in number 3 on our bullet, is use an automatic approach to correct the history for the outlier. So it's not going into the database and correcting it, but in the forecasting process, we'll use an algorithm to automatically correct for it. This has one big advantage, and it's that adjective automatic. The fact is this can be done automatically, and it doesn't impact the data in your database. Okay, so this is one of these pragmatic things. I would say, as a best practice, if we know what caused the problem, we fix it. And that's what bullets number 1 and 2 are talking about. If we know it was a promotion, if we know it was a stock out, if we know it was a data, an IT error, then we go and we either build a model that models the promotion or the stock out, or we go back to IT and we correct the history. We get the right data in the first place. On the other hand, if we're dealing with tens of thousands of items, we can't go through them all, then sometimes the fact that we can go through and look for our most egregious errors, our biggest ones, and do something automatically can improve our forecasts, again, with that trade-off of knowing I don't have time to go through and review all of them, and I'm trying to do the best I can with limited resources. So this automatically approaching it using a statistical correction algorithm is an option. The last option is an important one. Take no action. When you run a report, when you do a test, you sometimes get back what's called a false positive. In other words, I'm looking for outliers, and I get a big list of them, and I look at one and I say to myself, that's not an outlier. That's just part of the normal variation in the data, and I don't need to take any action. I'm not going to correct for it. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit after we go back to our example about false positives and how to avoid them and how to balance them with finding real problems. So these are our 4 options when we find outliers. Let's go back to our example and let's consider this one. So this is the biggest outlier in the set. We've decided that in my example, let's say I go research this, and sure enough we were stocked out in January of 2013, and then we have a lot more shipments the following month because we were back in stock. And so what I have here again is something happened, and ideally I would model what happened. So one option to do this is what's called an event model. We actually had a webinar a few months ago on event modeling. It's up on the YouTube site if you want to run it on demand, and it will give you the details. But essentially it builds a statistical model that allows you to build in events or things that happen as part and parcel of the model. So I'm going to click on this data point here, that trough, and I'm going to say that was an event. And in fact, that was a stock out. So I'm going to mark it as a stock out. Okay? And I might mention for the Forecast Pro users out there, I am running Forecast Pro Track version 8.1, which is actually being launched this week. And this event manager is some new functionality. You could do this kind of event modeling in 8.0, but it wasn't quite as convenient. So some of you might be seeing some screens you haven't seen before. So I've marked this as a stock out, and the following month I'm going to mark also as an event because it also has an unusual data point. And in this case I'm going to mark it as a post stock out. So the month after a stock out has unusual demand as well, so I'm going to mark that. And when I click commit, it will build the event model. And what I want you to watch are these data points here, because they're going to be corrected, or modeled, I should say, by our event model, and also look at the impact on the forecast. So I'm going to go ahead and click commit, and that tells the program to build the model. You'll notice those outliers are gone. Okay, we're fitting those 2 points really well, so there's certainly no outliers there. The forecast is dramatically changed because those outliers were the biggest source of variation and we're having a very large impact on the forecast. So this event model approach for this item, because we knew what was happening, works very well. And in fact, now that item is no longer flagged as an outlier because it's not. We've corrected for it. Our second biggest outlier is this top one here. I'll double click on that one. And here's another example. So again, this is the process. We have generated an outlier report. We have sorted it to concentrate first on the items of most important. So we filtered it, so we're just looking at our type A items. And B, we sorted it by the size of the outlier so that we concentrate on the big ones first. So this is a big outlier. It's this peak here. And that peak falls in November. And you can see the preceding Novembers really didn't have that. So I think it's a legitimate outlier. And if we look at the forecast, you can also see here's November's peak. And big outliers will often cause either a spike or a trough in the forecast the same period the following year. And that's certainly what we're looking at here. So the question is how to proceed. Again, going back to our list, The question is, do we know what happened? If we know what happened, perhaps we build another event model. Is it a data problem? Probably not here, okay, because the rest of the data looks good. Do you want to use an automatic approach? Maybe. Do you want to take no action? Probably not. Here we have a direct impact on the forecast, and at least inspecting this visually, we can see, we can see that it does have a big impact on our projection. So again, I would say in this case, we do want to correct for it because of the impact on the forecast. If I were to research this and determine, hey, that was a promoted month, probably I'd go for an event. This is just an example, and what I want to do for the example is to show you how an automatic approach would work. So what I'm going to say is, instead of using that historic demand point, which is an outlier, replace it with the fitted value, which is that red one. And to do that, I'll tell the program to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to come down here under Outliers, and instead of just detecting, I'm going to correct it. And if you watch the graph, there we go. The main thing that you'll notice is the forecast changed. And so that big spike in November is now much more of a typical November. The code on our report has gone from detected to corrected, and we've got a little flag here that tells us that we're correcting for that item. So again, let's summarize a little bit and think about our detection algorithm. What we are doing is running an algorithm to detect outliers. After we've done so, we then organize the outliers for review. We organize them to start with the ones of most importance to the company first, and then, time permitting, proceed to the ones of lesser import. What do we do when we find them? Well, we can use an alternative forecasting approach. We saw an example of building a event model, or we could correct the history. Again, appropriate if perhaps there were some data issues in creating the data, or we could use an automatic approach, which is what we just did. So a couple of comments before we move on. One is correcting for outliers, looking for them, taking action. This tends to be a very intensive operation the first time you do it, because the first time you do it, presumably you're going to be correcting a lot of these things. We're going to be building some more appropriate models that gets rid of these outliers. We're going to be deciding where to correct them. And that means that this process can be very time-consuming when you first do it. But as it becomes part of your forecasting process, it gets easier and easier and takes less time because you've corrected a lot of the ones as you've gone. So you're just really dealing with the new ones. Okay, so now let's continue. And we're going to go on to exception reports. And before we do that, we're going to run a couple of polls here. So Eric, if you can start our next poll. So the poll asks, do you currently use exception reports as part of your forecast review process? It's a yes or no reply, and the answers are coming in. And they're slowing down, so we'll go ahead and close that poll, and let's display the results. And here we go. So actually now it's kind of interesting. We've got about 2/3 of us, 64%, are saying no, they don't currently use exception reports. And about 1/3, or 36% actually, are saying yes. So now a question for the 36%ers, okay? So if you are using exception reports, what type of reports are you looking at? So we're going to put up another poll question. And this one, instead of just answering with a single response, if more than one apply, go ahead and select all that apply. But if you're using exception reports, there's a question of what are you monitoring? Is it just the previously generated forecasts to what happened? So I'm looking at, how were the forecasts I created last month compared to what actually happened? Are you monitoring the current forecast, say, by the same value in the previous year? So are we looking, for the history? Or are there just some rules embedded in the exception reports that say, for these items, here's an allowable range? The report that's still coming in a little bit, I'll give you guys just a few more seconds here. It's slowing down. Let's go ahead and close out the poll, Eric. And let's display our results. So here we go. The most popular here, coming in at 59% of us, are saying previously generated forecasts. We're comparing them to what actually happened. So the idea here is if we had last year, or not last year, if the last forecasting period had a big forecast error compared to what actually happened, then we are going to look at those items. So the concept is if last month we had an issue with this one, we're going to look at this item. Alternatively, the other options are we're going to compare the forecast to previous forecasts, so as the forecast for this item changed a lot, or current forecast to last year's values, and then finally, again, other defined thresholds. So let's close our poll, and Eric's going to switch back to presentation mode. Just takes a second to do so. There we go. And let's talk about exception reports. Okay. So first, what's the basic idea behind exception reports? Again, it's a comparison. So if the exception report is focusing on the forecast, we're going to compare the forecast, let's call the value of the forecast, we'll call that A, to some sort of expected value for it. We'll call that B. So we're comparing two things. We flag as an exception any forecast where the difference between the forecast and what we're comparing it to exceeds what we've defined as an allowable threshold. Okay? So we can do this a number of ways, just as our poll indicated, but some of the common ones are listed here. We could compare the forecast to, say, the same value last year. So we can compare it to the history. And if it's changed a whole lot, that's indicating one we might want to look at. We could compare it to a previously generated forecast. So last month we had a 30% error on this item. That's much too high, and therefore we're going to give it some attention this time around. We can look at, again, different ways of looking at it. But let's actually go to an example. And let's go into the product here. And this is actually a different data set. For those who've attended some of our webinars in the past, it's probably a familiar one. What we're looking at is sales from a commercial bakery that sells muffins and cakes to large grocery chains. And on the screen, what we have is an exception report. And what we're looking at in this exception report is the forecast created last period. So the last forecast we generated versus what actually happened. So it's forecast versus actual. You'll notice that we're showing a couple of things here. We have the Pareto codes again, our ABCs. We have our thresholds. We're saying if the error is plus or minus 25%, if that difference between what we forecast and what actually happened is 25% or more, flag it as an exception. So these lower and upper bounds are our thresholds. Here's our first forecast value, 5,110. The actual came in at 3,700. So we were off by 1,410 units, and that equates to a 38% error. And because that 38 is greater than 25, it flagged this as an exception. And each line in the report is calculated in a similar fashion. So once again, we've generated lots of exceptions that potentially we go through and look at. And once again, we want to do some sorting and filtering to organize our time. So let's actually do it the same way. Let's go and just concentrate first on our A items. So I'm going to just select the A items. And that cuts down the number of exceptions by quite a few. And as we go through to review some of this, I'm going to actually sort it. Let's sort it by the percent deviation. If I can get at it. Here we go. And I'm going to sort it from the largest. Here, I'll pull it over here so you can see it. From the largest to the smallest. And there we go. So our first one, I'm going to go ahead and let's double click on it. That'll navigate to it. Okay, I think I'll turn off confidence limit so we can see it a little better. And so this was flagged as an exception. Last month we forecasted 5,640 units. it came in at 316. Okay, so we were off by over 5,000 units, and the percentage that we were off by is a whopping 1,684%. So I would say for most of us that's probably an unacceptable error, and we want to take some action. So again, we have generated a report. We have organized it to look at our biggest errors and our type A items, and we're starting off with the biggest one, which is right here. So this is similar to looking through an outlier report, but rather than history, now we're dealing with forecasts. Let's go back to our slides. And how do we handle these exceptions? What do we do? It's a similar list to last time. If we look at it and we determine, hey, the reason the forecast was so bad was because we missed something. You know, there was a promotion. There was something that occurred that we need to accommodate. Then we might change the forecasting model. On the other hand, if perhaps we know what happened by knowledge of the future, then maybe we go and judgmentally make some adjustments to the forecast. Or once again, we could decide, yes, this is on the report, but it's a false positive. It just, no action is required. So different ways we can approach this. Let's go back to our specific example and take a look at it. This is kind of an interesting example. This particular product is only available in certain times of the year. And so you can see there's a whole bunch of months here that are 0. And they fall at the same time every year. So this seems to be, it says it's a seasonal variety pack. It seems to be offered in the winter. And in these months, really tends to be 0. We didn't forecast 0 here. We forecasted 5,000. But this is probably should be 0. So how are we going to go about this? There are multiple ways we could do this. I could change the forecasting model. This kind of data is pretty common. We had another example where we had somebody manufacturing automobile tires. They had some which were snow tires and only sold in certain months. You could take a model-based approach to this. You could build a model that only models the months where it's available, or you could just say, you know what, I'm going to make some changes judgmentally. I don't like that forecast of 5,000. I'm going to change it. And for this example, I'm not saying it's the best approach for this particular client, but for this example, I'm going to show you how that might be done. So what I'm going to do is to actually close our report window here and open up an override window. And we can see here's our forecast, and here's the history. And you can see it was zeros for the last couple of years here. And in fact, I think if I make this just a little bigger, you can see another year there. So we have these zeros in July and August. And I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and put in a 0 for July and August. And we'll commit to that. And you can see I've just changed our forecast to 0 rather than 5,000. So I'm overriding the forecast. Here's May and June. For the last couple of years, those have been 0. We seem to have some residual sales. Maybe they're just selling out the remaining inventory. I'm not quite sure. But let's say our decision is May and June should be 0 as well. I'll go ahead and enter that and commit to it. And you can see our new forecast down here at the bottom. And it's, again, these periods where historically we've had 0 demand, we now have 0 demand. These overrides will be maintained. Just as as you correct outliers, you're often making next month's work easier. That same thing applies here too. So we've got some corrections there, and we're good to go. So again, we kind of looked at some different approaches to this. And this idea of going through and looking through exceptions is another way we can do it. Really quickly, because we're starting to eat into our time, I'm going to turn off the overrides. I'm going to open a different report, something called an item report. I'm going to show you one more trick, if you will, which is this report has the number of historic periods. And one of the things that's very true is when you have short data sets, particularly if you're using automatic approaches, it can be problematic. So I'm going to actually sort this data by the number of historic data points. I'll do smallest to largest. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the first one only has 12 data points. So here's an item with only 12 data points, and it's giving me a flatline forecast. And it's probably not a good forecast. This is sales of corn muffins. I know that the other muffins tend to be seasonal, and this one's not a seasonal forecast. The reason is because the data is too short to support it. So here's a case where I'd probably change the model. I might use a top-down approach. I might even just do something really simple, like say, why not just use the same as last year when we only have this amount of data? So I think I'll do that. I'll say, let's do same as last year and change that forecast. But what I want to get across here is this is all reviewing forecasts, looking for problems. Outlier detection is one type of problem in the history. Exception reports can find problems with the forecast by comparing them to other values. Here's yet a third thing we can do, which is to look at items with a very limited demand history where the forecasts are likely to be suspect. And again, throughout, filtering the data by ABC categorizations and by the size of the error or maybe the number of data points can also help us in organizing our time. So let's get to a summary, and then we'll take some questions. So what have we been looking at? Well, a couple of things. Outliers in historic demand can result in poor forecasts. This is particularly true if we're using automatic algorithms which are looking at the past history and just extrapolating it forward. Outliers can be trouble. Outlier detection algorithms are one way to spot them, and after we've spotted them, then we can walk through them and decide how they should be addressed. And again, sorting and filtering can help us with that review process. The other thing we can review instead of the history is what about forecasts, okay? And there some of the tools are exception reporting, where instead of going through each and every one, I can use exception reports to do what some people call managing by exception. Let's look at the places where we have indicated there's a high probability of an issue, and that's where we're going to focus our human attention. And as I mentioned several times, as part of this review process, having some tools that allow you to sort and filter and look at the data different ways can be very useful. Okay, so a couple of items before we get to the Q&A. First of all of the examples from today's webinar in terms of the live example part, we're using the Forecast Pro software. I know that a lot of you out there already use the software. If you're interested in learning more about Forecast Pro, we'd love to show you more and tell you more about it. You can request a live WebEx demo for your team. And in fact, if you want, you can even just put it in the chat window and somebody will get back to you and schedule a demo for you. There's also a wealth of information on forecastpro.com, including a demonstration pack which can be downloaded, which includes some deep dives or some close looks at the product. And if you have questions, you can always call or email as well. So again, we'd love to tell you more about Forecast Pro if you're interested. In addition to these webinars, we do offer other forms of training and education in business forecasting. We run seminars and webinars, as you know, and also product training workshop for the Forecast Pro users out there. Those can be either remote-based or live, whatever makes most sense in a given situation. We also have a public class coming up. It's actually next month, November 13th through 15th. It'll be held in Boston. It's a 3-day seminar it's called Business Forecasting Techniques, Applications, and Best Practices. I will actually be teaching that class with some assistance from others. We'll go through all sorts of different approaches to forecasting, how to apply it to your own data. It will include some hands-on as well as some classroom-style lectures. If you are interested in learning, please visit the website, and we have a more detailed description. But it's always a lively and entertaining class. In addition to that, I would encourage you to look through our website. And we have something new, actually, which is the Forecast Pro. It's our blog. And we are posting all sorts of content up there. If you actually subscribe to it, which you can do by just visiting the blog and putting your email in, then anytime we have a new post, you'll be kept up to date. But it includes announcements about webinars and seminars. It includes a series of educational articles we call Forecasting 101, For the Forecast Pro users out there, there's a bunch of tips and tricks out there, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it. There's a whole lot of good content out there. Okay, our next webinar. I think this is the last slide before the Q&A, but we run a live webinar every quarter, and we're very pleased. For our next webinar is going to be presented by Coco Crum, who is a principal at Oliver White Americas. Coco is a very knowledgeable individual on a variety of topics. She has written an excellent book on demand planning and another one on S&OP, and her topic, not surprisingly, is going to be both about demand planning and S&OP as they relate to forecasting. So what her talk will go through is how do we get the different parts of the organization working together. We have input from sales and marketing and operations. We have a statistical forecast, and our goal is to create a consensus and really come up and work with one set of numbers. How do we go about that? So Colleen will give us some good advice about how to navigate through that. That webinar is available to sign up. I would encourage you to go ahead and do it now. You can visit the website and sign up. We'll send you reminders as it gets closer, but there's no downside to signing up early. Okay, so that does bring us to the questions and answers, and Eric Sabatis will let me know what's come in.
So we've had a couple good questions. This one's been asked a couple times, so I'll put it into one to benefit the Forecast Pro users and those who are not. Forecast Pro uses 4 standard deviations as the default outlier detection threshold. How is that default threshold derived, and in general, is there a sort of standard for standard deviations?
Okay, that's an excellent question. It goes into a little more depth than I did in the presentation, but let me bring up the product and explain what the question is. When we look at, let me actually open up the exception report. When we look at a, actually I'm sorry, let me open up the outlier report is what I wanted. And let me go back to our automotive example. Okay, when we look for outliers, there is a question of sensitivity. And I sort of alluded to this a little bit about if we are very sensitive and we find a whole lot of outliers, then our review is going to be lengthy. So the question is, how big does the error have to be flagged as an outlier? And the program allows you to set that sensitivity. And the default is 4 standard deviations, which is a very high default, meaning that it's if you've got something that's more than 4 standard deviations away from the mean, it's a very unusual data point. So again, 3 standard deviations, you're looking at 1 in 100 by chance. 4, it's more like 1 in 10,000. So when something is significant at that level, it's a very significant value. Why do we set it that high? Because we're trying to avoid false positives. So if I set that to something like, let's say I set it to 3 standard deviations, 1 in 100, that means that if I'm dealing with monthly data, say I've got 5 years of it, I'm going to have every other series, I'm going to have a false positive. You see, because every 100 data points, it's going to detect one that's not an outlier, that's just there by chance. So you really want this setting pretty high. How high? It depends on your resources. This is just a default. Pretty much if anything's detected at 4 standard deviations, there's a very, very good chance it's a real outlier. If you could change this. If you're getting too many false positives, you could push it up to 5 or maybe 4.5. If you feel like everything you're looking at is definitely an outlier, you might lower it. It means more outliers would be detected, but perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps in that particular situation, you actually have more outliers. So it's a default setting. It was chosen as sort of a balance between false positives and early detection. And I think it's a decent setting in lieu of specific information about what we're working with. But again, feel free to adjust it, but with the knowledge of how it impacts the number of detections. Next question, please.
To follow up on that, and once again, for the benefit of users and non-users alike, when you correct for an outlier, what's a good approach for how to correct it, and maybe how does Forecast Pro go about doing that?
Okay, so that gets us back to when you detect for an outlier, how do we proceed? So we did have a slide on that. So, okay, first of all, best practice as far as I'm concerned is to detect outliers and then decide how to address them, okay? So there is a difference between detection and automatic correction and just detection and then deciding what to do. This slide talks about deciding what to do. And I really think ideally you use some knowledge of why the outlier occurred. If it occurred because of a known event, this was a promotion, this was a business interruption, this was a stock out, then I would say don't just automatically correct it. Build a model that accommodates and that is capable of forecasting data that have been promoted or where stockouts occur, etc. That was the event approach we took. Likewise, the second bullet, if there's a data issue, fix the data issue. So back to the other part of the question, which is how do we go about that automatic? If we are going to use an automatic, and I'd say at times you're forced to because of the sheer scale of what you're forecasting, if we are going to use an automatic, we look for the biggest error and replace it with the fitted value. So we run a forecasting model using the data and we replace it. We went through that on some of the slides. We do it in an iterative process. So we find the biggest error first, we correct for it, we build a new model with the corrected history, and we see if there are any more outliers, and we continue until we don't find any. This is a fairly intensive operation from a calculation point of view, and most software solutions don't do this. When we implemented this algorithm, we looked around at other approaches to this. They were almost all single-pass solutions, and as I illustrated with the slides, it really is an inferior way of doing it. We've done a fair amount of experimentation with outlier detection and correction and are very happy with our approach. I do think it is the right way to do it, but it's certainly not the only way. Probably time for one last question.
Yeah, let's squeeze in one more. Okay. If an order is booked in a given month, we might not ship it until the next month, and therefore it gets recorded as a sale in month 2 as opposed to month 1. Is it better to use the booking month or the shipping month, or does it really matter?
Okay. Part of this is less about outliers and correction and really just about data and demand. So when you are forecasting, there is a question of, I'm going to use a statistical method. I need to put in a demand history. What should that demand history consist of? You want it to approximate unconstrained demand as closely as possible. In general, if your client is placing orders, and ideally they'd love it for you to ship it instantaneously, then the orders is really a better estimate of demand than when it actually ships. Okay, so as a general rule of thumb, I would say orders are a better approximation to demand than history or shipments, and therefore I'd prefer to use that. Some people have point of sale data, and that's even better. Okay, it's again, what we're after is what is the demand, and we can't always measure it directly, but we look at what data is available to us, and we choose whatever we feel is closest to the unconstrained demand. Okay, so with that, I want to thank you all for attending. I hope you got something out of it, and remind you that this is an ongoing series, so we hope to see you again at a future webinar. And if you have asked questions and we haven't replied to them as part of the session, you'll be receiving an email reply shortly. So thanks again, and hope to see you at the next one.